Hello and welcome to Lesson 2 of DeTech Theory's Introductory Programming course. Today we're going to be talking about variables and data types that you find in the Java programming language. So first we're going to go over what data types are. So data types characterize the type of value that is being stored in memory. Some data types are numerical, some are true or false variables, and there are others as well. Different data types take up different amounts of space and they all behave differently. So our first category of variable or data type is the primitive variable. So a primitive variable stores a value under a reference name. Other types of variables simply store a memory address for the data. There are many different types of variables, primitive variables, including bytes, shorts, longs, and floats. However, we will mainly be using three: ints, doubles, and booleans. An int variable is a 32-bit integer value. A double variable is a 64-bit decimal value. And a boolean variable is technically just 1 bit, true or false, i.e. 0 or 1. String literals are technically not primitive variables, but they're treated as such in Java. They are any sequence of letters, numbers, and symbols in quotations, but they are not technically primitive variables. But we have the supports in Java that allow us to use them in the same way as a primitive variable. So let's talk a bit more about string literals. String literals are a series of characters, as I mentioned before, enclosed in quotations. They can include numbers, decimals, characters, and symbols. In order to print a string literal or any other primitive variable, we use the syntax system.out.print or system.out.println with the string literal or primitive variable in the parentheses. Commands such as print or println with the parentheses are called methods, and in Java, a semicolon is necessary at the end of the line in order to execute a method. The print method prints successive calls to the method on the same line. The println method will print a new line after printing the content within the parentheses. The details of how system.out.print does its job is not necessary knowledge for your everyday programming use. So as long as we can depend on it working, we don't need to know any more about how it works. This is called abstraction. Abstraction is a common aspect of our lives. The mechanics of a car, for instance. We don't need to know the specific mechanics behind the brakes so long as the brakes do their job. So in order to add formatting, such as a new line or a tab, we use escape sequences. The format of escape sequences is always a backslash followed by a character or a symbol. Escape sequences are added in the middle of a string literal or in between quotations. A space is not needed before or after the escape sequence, otherwise that space will also be included in the output. Because escape sequences are signaled by a backslash, it's important to note that an escape sequence is necessary to print a backslash when you're using Java. Additionally, adding a quote requires an escape sequence as it will otherwise prematurely end the string literal. Okay, so those are certain characters that we have to use an escape sequence for. We can't try to include them in our strings without. So now let's talk a bit about doubles and ints. Because ints are only 32 bits, there's a maximum and a minimum value. So if we exceed the max value, it will reset it to the bottom of the range. So for example, if you tried to use an integer variable with the value of 214748368, which is one more than the maximum value, the system would instead use the minimum value, which is negative 214748368. So it's like a big circle. Where you can't exceed the maximum and minimum value. You don't need to memorize these values. You can use the command integer.minValue as written here or integer.maxValue, and that will automatically print or access the number that you need to. Doubles are 64-bit decimal values, but the minimum and maximum values for double are less useful and not really necessary to worry about for our purposes. So moving on to instantiating variables. Instantiating, or declaring variables, is very important in programming. If we wanted to write a program about the number of bugs in a population, for instance, instead of rewriting the same number 20 times and risk making a mistake somewhere, we could simply use a reference name for the value, such as a variable called bug population. In every place where we would otherwise write the number, we could write bug population instead. This allows us to change the value of a population without having to find every instance of the value and manually change it. But in order to use variables such as that, you have to declare it. So first, you must declare the type, which is printed above in yellow. So you can see string, Boolean, int, double, etc. The variable declaration is read as hello is assigned to the reference word of type string, or true is assigned to the reference val of type Boolean. So there are certain naming conventions and rules that you have to follow in Java. Typically, reference words are written in camel case, where the first word is lowercase and following words begin with an uppercase letter. They don't have to be written this way, but it's a common convention. And so to avoid confusion, it is recommended. Reference words cannot have spaces, but they can contain any characters, digits, or symbols. They can't start with digits, though. They are case sensitive, so 2 capital A's is different than a capital A and a lowercase a. They also cannot be reserve words, or words that are reserved as descriptors or have specific uses in the Java language. In most IDEs and compilers that you'll use, these words turn a different color when they're typed. In this presentation, reserve words are light blue or yellow. When we want to change the value of a variable, we simply rewrite the reference word. For example, in this case, that would be the word aliens, and we assign it our new value, 7. We do not need to redeclare the type, which is int. For all subsequent uses of aliens, the value will be 7. This works for all primitive variables. So constants are another type of variable, which has a set and unchangeable value. This is useful for things that will never change, such as the value of pi, 3.14, etc. To declare a constant, as a convention, we write the reference word in all capitals and use the reserve word final before int. This means that you won't be able to change the value of the variable later on in your program. In Java, we can convert some data types, but not all. For example, int and double can be converted to one another because they're both numbers, but not through the same process. For example, int to double is a widening conversion, and double to int is a narrowing conversion. Obviously, we couldn't convert strings and integer values to each other because those are 2 different types of objects that behave completely differently. So let's talk about a widening conversion. To do a widening conversion, we simply create a new variable of type double and assign it the int variable as the value. This will tack a 0.0 to the end of the integer value, turning it into a double. It's that easy because you're not losing any data. All you're doing is widening the definition of the number that you're using. A narrowing conversion is a bit more difficult, as we have to force or typecast the variable. First, we begin to instantiate a new int variable and assign it our previous double value. However, before the double value, we must write the new type int in parentheses, because we're going to be losing information. It's important to note that in Java, you're never going to be rounding your number up or down. Instead, you're going to be truncating it. So even if your double value is 3.99999, if you typecast it to an int variable, it will become the value 3. It won't be rounded. The decimal part will only be chopped off. Finally, let's talk about concatenation. When we want to combine multiple fragments, we must use something called concatenation. The most basic application is concatenating different elements in a print statement. We can also use concatenation in other settings, such as declaring variables. To concatenate two fragments, we simply add a plus sign between the two with no quotation marks around it. If a fragment is a string literal, you must enclose just that fragment in quotation marks. If we do not concatenate any string literal before or in between the concatenation of two numeric values, they will be added together, not concatenated together. Thank you so much for joining us today. That's all we have for today's lesson. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you again next time.